Hey, Ian Stewart here with IanStewartCycles. I'm posting this interview I did for Full Disclosure with Robin Farzad. I got to guest host his podcast, which I get to do a lot of times. I just interviewed Thomas Dolby, so you should go check that out. But last year, right after Kristen Faulkner won 2 Olympic golds in Paris, went on to race in the Worlds, went on to do all sorts of amazing things. She had an incredible summer. I got to interview her for Full Disclosure. So Robin has been nice enough to let me post it here. And I wanted to because the racing season, at least for her, has just started. She's just done, I think, 2 races. So I want you to hear our conversation from last year, right after her wins and incredible. I think she was just on a quick break. So we talk about her venture capitalism of how it guides her cycling. We talked about, of course, her Olympic golds. We talked about mental health. We talked about how racing even works, how her team's set up, what do sponsors do, the whole thing. So it's a really great interview. So I hope you check it out. I hope you share it. Follow Kristen Faulkner. She's amazing. Follow Robin Farzad on Full Disclosure. You could go check out his podcast on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. I also have a podcast, Mechanics of Transportation, where I talk about transportation issues, and I have another one called History Reinvented, where I talk about the history and future of Mayo Bridge and Island in Richmond, Virginia. And if that weren't enough, I have a music show on Mixcloud called Ian's World Music Show, because for 17 years I had a music show on a public radio station where I was also a transportation reporter. So enjoy my conversation with Kristen Faulkner. So, Kristen Faulkner, welcome to Full Disclosure with me, Ian Stewart, in for Robin Farzad. I'm going to start off with asking you a question. Of course, I'm going to ask you a question. It's a podcast for me to ask you questions. Every school year, when I would return from summer break, we were supposed to write what I did for summer. Not that you were on a break, but tell me about your summer. Did anything happen?
Oh, did anything happen? Wow, this was probably the most eventful summer of my life, to be honest. It was a roller coaster. It was amazing in the best ways. It was challenging in the best ways. And the preparation before was incredibly challenging. The celebrations after were so fun and full of family and friends, and it's been incredibly busy. But yes, I could write a book about my summer, which I'm starting to do. But yeah, it's a full book worth of content.
And not only that, I mean, you won the 2 golds, which, the women individual race, first time an American winning in about 40 years since the LA Olympics, which I understand you want to go back to when they hit LA next time. Great event. I went in 84 for some things, not bike racing. But you also went straight to the Tour de Femme avec Swift. They have such a long title to say. And then maybe got a little break, and then you did the Worlds, right? Like you went back to back to back.
Yeah. Yes, it was a very busy summer. I finished the road race and then, was full gas into team pursuit. Like I couldn't even celebrate after the road race because I had to psychologically keep my mindset, very calm. And so I had to minimize the amount of adrenaline and the celebrations afterwards. And then after team pursuit, there was a full day of media until after midnight. And then I had a travel day to the Tour de France, was 100% focused on the Tour de France. And so there really wasn't a moment for me to take in, the big victories that I had and kind of how meaningful it was. And then, going back to Colorado, I had sponsor events. And so it really wasn't until after the World Championship when I kind of came home and could really sit down and say, wow, this was, and start to really comprehend and decompress everything that had happened this summer. And it's still happening. It's been such a busy summer that I feel like I'm still trying to comprehend and process everything that's happened. So yeah, it
Yeah.
doesn't stop.
You have I'm sure, but as a racer, as a pro cyclist, you also, I think, have an off time. Like the season's almost done, unless you're going to start taking up cyclocross or gravel or anything like that. Are you?
No, I've always wanted to, but I think this is the season for me to rest and not do that, So I actually finished my season. The World Championship was my last race. And, it's interesting. It was normally by the end of the season, I'm a little bit cracked. I'm mentally and physically exhausted. And this season, I didn't feel that because I think I still had a bit of momentum in me. And so after the World Championships, I was like, wow, I could keep going. But my schedule was so busy. I was like, I have podcasts, I have speaking engagements, I have sponsor events. And so it was actually kind of the aftermath of the Olympics, which made my schedule logistically impossible to continue doing my races. But mentally, I was actually feeling okay because I think I had the second wind after the Olympics where I was like, oh, well, let's keep going. I feel motivated. And so, but I think it's a good thing for me to now rest. I actually have taken over a week off the bike at this point, and so my season ended after the World Championship, and now I am doing a lot of yoga, some stretching. I haven't even gone on a run. Like I haven't been doing any kind of other cardio, and I think it's good for everyone's bodies after such a crazy intense season to really take that break and to take the rest that they need.
Yeah, definitely yoga, and it also helps with your mental health too. I mean, you're on such a high endorphin level. I think that you need a break after that. And like you're saying, you need to it really takes a long time to, unwind. I'm assuming, well, I'm sure.
Definitely. And I think that's something that is really undervalued in professional sports is taking those breaks. For me, I just mentioned like this is the first season where I haven't felt really burned out by the end. And so much of it is I took two breaks during the season, which were longer than I've ever taken before. So the May, after nationals and kind of the May block, I took, I think, 3 to 5 days off the bike completely. And then after the Tour de France, I took a week off the bike, full 7 days. And so I think for me, I had never taken breaks like that during the season before. And it really allowed me to finish strong. The World Championship, I didn't have a great result, partially because I was so cold that I couldn't even shift my gears or eat or drink anything with my fingers, had no dexterity. But physically and mentally, I felt really good. And I think being able to know that going into future seasons, that taking those mini breaks is actually a really good thing, I think will help me perform even better in years to come.
And you mentioned, mental support from teams. I think in watching teams that I've watched over the past 4 or 5 years of studying racing, I feel like they've ramped up in terms of allowing riders and racers to have a mental health break and to take time off. And I feel like they're really supportive, although there's other stories out there in the ether that where they're not so supportive, or maybe that's just the UCI, which we don't need to get into. That's a whole other branch. Can you, with that in mind, can you break down kind of how teams are set up and how they work? I think the average viewer might not, who only maybe watches the Tour de France, doesn't understand how kind of a team works. They're huge juggernauts, right, of this ecosystem.
Yeah, definitely. And it's very different from what I think people on the outside see. It's different from mountain biking, it's different from triathlon. And so economically, so I race for a team who pays my salary, and the team has their own sponsors, which the team goes out and gets. So we're sponsored by EF Education, we're sponsored by Oatly, we're sponsored by Cannondale, we're sponsored by Whoop and Wahoo and these other brands. And so they give the team money in exchange for media coverage, and then the team pays my salary. And I have a contract with my team. And some riders have it; they're a 1099. Other riders on every team is set up differently. Sometimes you're full employees, and so that's really the economic model of cycling. And I'm allowed to go out and get my own personal sponsors, but only if they don't conflict with any of the team
Hmm.
sponsors or any of the potential team sponsors. And so that's economically how it works. And then within a team, you have your directors who are the ones in the car giving instructions during the race through race radio. And so they're the ones who really understand race strategy. They help figure out which races you're going to do, your calendar for the season, which races you should target. And so that's the directors. And then you have a general manager who kind of oversees the entire organization. And so for EF Ole Cannondale, that's Ezra Trump. And she is the manager of the women's team. She came from Jumbo Visma. She's phenomenal. And she really manages kind of all of the kind of oversight of the team. And so that's from both the business side, but the performance side, and she manages all the staff. And then within a team, you also have a team doctor, you have a team nutritionist, you have performance manager who looks at, for me, my performance manager is Emma Trott, and she really works with my coach to figure out what is it that Kristen needs from a holistic perspective. Does she need a nutritionist? Does she need a strength coach? Does she need, a big break during the season? Should we have her prioritize time trial or road racing or stage racing? And whatever we're going to have her prioritize, how do we get the resources we need to allow her to really prioritize that? And so Emma's looking at kind of the macro performance mindset. And then we have Nate Wilson, who's my coach, and Nate is the one who builds out my training plans day to day, week to week. And Nate is also the one who, if Emma comes and says, we really want Kristen to prioritize time trials this year, then Nate goes and builds out a plan for me to help prepare for the time trials. And so, everyone really works together as a team. And it's really nice internally having that support, because I feel that, I have a full team around me, and we're kind of covering all the ground of different performance aspects that I need to be successful. And so that's
Yeah.
really great. And then, different teams are set up a little differently. EF Foley Canada, we have a lot of resources internally for staff, and I feel incredibly supported. But there's also smaller teams out there who don't have the nutritionist or the performance manager or some of the other resources. Team doctor. They maybe just have one director and a mechanic, and that's it.
Yeah, and a lot of those teams too don't even have a women's team just yet. So I know it's frustrating if you're trying to build the women's side of the sport. There's no if there's no team, you can't. It dwindles the competition. It dwindles the ad dollars, which we'll talk about in a minute. That's fascinating how kind of teams work, and I appreciate you explaining that to people, because I don't think they understand just what's involved. You're not just getting on your bike and going, "All right, I'm racing." I mean, it took me a long time when I first started watching the Tour de France years ago, like, how come the person who won the stage isn't the winner right now? And that's a whole other thing. So I feel, your background, which you've talked about in many interviews, you started out, you went to Harvard and computer science, and you also, were a venture capitalist. And you've mentioned this in other interviews, but because it says full disclosure, with me, Ian Stewart, talking to Kristen Faulkner, we talk about the business of culture and the culture of business. And you have a really unique way of how you approach bike racing. I mean, you did competitive rowing. You were a swimmer, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was a swimmer too.
Yes, I was a
Yay.
swimmer. I was a swimmer when I was young. It was my first sport.
Yeah, me too. Woo, go swimmers. But so you were a venture capitalist. Explain how you learned, what you learned from venture capitalism into being a bike racer. And I know you've said this before, but I think it's really fascinating how you approached bike racing in this way.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think the biggest thing that venture capital taught me was how to take calculated risks. And I've talked about this before, but really, it's you have to be calculated, and you have to take a risk. And I think when I entered bike racing, there was a lot of aversion to these really bold solo attacks, because the probability of winning a solo attack is quite low. You might win 10%. But the expected value is actually pretty good, because if you win, you win big. And expected value is the probability of success multiplied by the magnitude of that success. And in investing, we often think about expected value. And so in venture capital, when we invest, about 30% of the companies maybe lose a little bit of money, 30% break even, 30% make money. And then you have this one, company maybe out of 10 that returns the entire fund and makes the most money. And so you're taking these really risky, bold bets, knowing that a small percentage of them are going to have these outsized returns. And when I approached bike racing, that's really how I thought about it. I didn't think about, what is the probability of this attack winning. I thought about what is the expected value of doing these solo attacks. And if I do one or two, maybe they fail, but I'm okay with that, because eventually one's going to succeed, and it's going to have this outsized win, and it's going to be this brilliant, amazing solo victory. And so I think a lot of riders, for whatever reason, and a lot of directors and a lot of people kind of looked at me as like, oh, who's this amateur? She started late. She doesn't understand the sport. She doesn't these are suicide attacks. She's not going to make it. And they focused a lot on the probability of my attack making it. And I thought about it more as a portfolio of moves, and the way that I had a portfolio of companies and venture capital, which, really, really is, which is like, yeah, any individual one, yes, they're not related to each other necessarily. They're kind of independent events. And so the success of one doesn't influence the success of another. But as a portfolio, if you do this enough, you learn, from different ones, you learn, what is the right moment to attack, and who are the best people to attack with, or what's the best group dynamic to attack from, and what is the terrain that you excel at. And when you launch an attack, are you good for the first 5 seconds? Are you good for the first 30 seconds? Like, when can you kind of settle into your threshold, sub-threshold pace? And so you learn all these things as you do them more and more. And eventually, what you get is what happened at the Olympics, which is this brilliant solo win. And I think it's interesting, because all of the times that it fails, people kind of look at you and they're like, oh, a failed move. Like, she doesn't know what she's doing. She doesn't, she's inexperienced. She came to the sport late. But then you have this, this brilliant solo win, and the people are like, oh my goodness, like, it actually works. And so I think I came into the sport feeling really comfortable taking those calculated risks and taking those outside bets. And in the beginning, people, thought I was amateur and inexperienced. And I kind of had to just endure that for a few years and know that I had my plan and it was different, but it worked for me. And it also played to my strengths as a, kind of time trialist rider. And so I had to kind of maintain conviction in my strategy, even when those around me were, kind of looking down or making fun of my strategy as being amateur.
And you mentioned too in a few interviews, which I really found fascinating, that it wasn't just, taking those skills that you just mentioned, but you really studied other races to see when people attacked, what their strategy was, and you created kind of a Venn diagram of sorts, or a graph of sorts of, when people attacked. You kind of break that down a little bit. I found that really fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. There's all these small things that go into making an attack successful. You have to attack from the back. You have to go not just out front, but you have to go to the side, a little bit so that it makes it harder for people to jump on your wheel. You have to make sure that you're attacking at the right time. I think I had a director on a team one time, and they always said, here's where we want you to attack. And I think that's not how you can approach that type of strategy, because it's not just where on the course is a good place to attack, but it's more about looking around. What is happening in the peloton right now? Or who's breathing hard? Who's a domestique? Are they out of position? Who's willing to chase you? Are they going to be the ones around you when you attack? And are you around a group of sprinters? Are you around a group of climbers? Are you around a group of time trialists? Are you, are you surrounded by domestiques or leaders right now? And I think all of that dynamic really goes into making it an attack successful or not. And so I think learning, as I watched races, as I experiment with attacks over and over, I started to really learn, like, what are all of the 100 variables that go into making an attack successful. And then the other thing I learned is kind of, once I make my move, then how do I maximize it? And so it's things like, I don't look back. Occasionally I'll look back to see if, I have a gap, but then once you're committed, you're fully committed, and you can't hesitate. You can't, at the Olympics, I didn't look back before the finish line because I knew that it was my only shot to win. And so there was no benefit to looking back. And I think those are the things, and even practicing my attacking training, like the 15-second or 5-second launch followed by the threshold effort. And so it's really about, training that system, and in training, I'm also working on my attacks. It's not just I'm not just training 5-minute efforts. I'm training a 30-second launch followed by a 2-minute threshold effort, and so I think those kinds of things, and how to have a successful one, is something I really studied over and over, both through watching other races and other riders, but also through experimentation myself.
And for people that don't know, I mean, riding in a peloton is got to be really intense. And how you were just mentioning, you have sprinters, you have climbers, you have domestiques, which are the people that carry the food and the water, that bring it up, that help, the main rider. I think in teams, and you could correct me because of course I haven't been on one, but you have a race leader, and you have, like, when you're on the bus before even hitting the race, it's kind of decided that, oh, this rider we really want to push to win because today is a sprint day, meaning it's flat and they could really go out, or today's a hill day and we're going to have Kristen Faulkner go up on the Girodani and attack this hill because she's an awesome climber. But I think people need to understand that all these dynamics are just like, you put all these variables into place in terms of exactly, what you're saying. Um, I'm just so excited. I'm sorry. I'm like trying to figure out what kind of question to say, but I think just explaining to people how that works is just, amazing that you were able to do that. There's no question there. I'm just fascinated by the Peloton, and I'll say one dumb question. It's got to be scary. I get dropped on group rides. One, because I don't like being surrounded by people. How is it being in a Peloton? Sorry, dumb fan
Yeah, honestly,
question.
when I first moved to Europe, I was terrified, and it's and I was so scared. I remember I had this laser focus when I was in the Peloton because I was so scared to look around, to eat or drink. I was just so focused on staying upright and not touching people around me. And I felt like the stampede. If anyone has seen that scene from Lion King where Simba is kind of running away and the stampede is just following him and chasing him, and he's terrified and he feels like he needs to outrun it. That's how I felt every single time I was in the peloton, which is like, there's all these scary people. They're around me. They're going fast. They're moving side to side. They're, rushing by me, fighting for my position, elbowing me. And that was really scary for me. And in America, the riding is very different because the roads are bigger here. The field sizes are smaller. And so when you go to Europe, you have these narrow roads, they're cobblestone, they're kind of mud on the side, massive field sizes. And so everyone is close together, and you really have to have much better bike handling skills. And so my first year, I really struggled with that. And I struggled with positioning, I struggled with feeling comfortable. But it's one of those things where, A, you get better the more you do it, but B, you have to build comfort putting yourself in uncomfortable situations. And so, the easy thing to do is just to ride in the back of the group, in the back of the peloton where it's safe, you're not surrounded by people. But the only way to get better is to really put yourself in that uncomfortable situation. And so for years, I had to do that. I had to say, okay, I'm going to try to fight for position as much as possible. And it might not help me in this race, but it's going to help me in the long run to get more comfortable with that. And I think it was just years and years of putting myself in those scary positions, that ultimately paid off. But I remember actually when I was first racing, there was a moment in a race where my teammate came up next to me and she started talking to me. She was like, Kristen. And I was just so laser focused looking forward. I did not even hear her. And she was like, Kristen, Kristen. And I did not even hear her because I was just so laser focused. And I think that was an important lesson for me, though, which is I was so much in my own world in that moment when I came because I was so nervous. And that experience, when we were debriefing later on the bus, and she was like, Kristen, like, why didn't you answer me? Were you ignoring me? And she was really offended. She thought I was just ignoring her. And I was like, I literally had no idea. And so it was a really big and important lesson for me. And that was the moment where I realized that, I had to be aware of, not just my own bike and my position, but really what was happening around me. And it was from that moment on where I think I developed a greater awareness of the people around me and started looking around and talking and feeling a lot more relaxed in the group. And it was because I had learned that I hadn't been doing that before. And so I think through these experiences, and my teammates giving me feedback, it all made me a better rider.
And one more fanboy kind of question in terms of the Peloton. You riding in Europe, you're riding through some incredibly beautiful places. Tour de Femme, the Olympics in Paris. Are you able to look at anything other than the Peloton? Like, do you catch a glance and go, "Oh, hey, there's this, there's that." Like, can you focus on any? I mean, not focus, but at least go, "Oh, wow, that ocean's beautiful." Can you do any of that, or is it really like, no, I'm in this? Like, doesn't matter where you are, you're in this Peloton.
Yeah, not really. I think it depends on the race, and I think it depends on where you are in the race and what your role is. And so I think, normally during a one day classics race, you're so focused on, like, it's so intense and you're so focused on the course and the riders that you don't really get to look around and enjoy the view. Whereas in a stage race, there might be days where you have, 2 hours where nothing eventful really happens. The group is kind of riding, casually together, and you can kind of look around. And so I think the type of race makes a difference. And then I think also if you're a lead rider, you're pretty focused until the finish line. Whereas if you're a domestique, you might do all of your work until 2/3 of the way through the race. And then the last third, you can kind of, chill and relax to the finish line. And during that last third, maybe you can take in the view. But it's always funny because when I watch races afterwards, I'm like, what in the world? Like, where is this place? Like, I didn't notice any of these monuments. And it's funny because after the Olympic road race, I was rewatching it and I went right by the Louvre. And I was like, I didn't go by the Louvre. Like, I don't remember racing by the Louvre. And it was this beautiful photo of me right in front of the Louvre, and I was like, I don't even remember that on the course. I had no idea that I had just bike rode past the Louvre. And I think even, with the Eiffel Tower behind me going into the finish line, like, I didn't even see the Eiffel Tower when I was racing. Like, I was just, you're so focused on the riders and yourself and the course. And so to answer your question, like, no, I don't really get to take in a lot of the view, but it is, I think there was one moment in Norway that I'll always remember. And it was funny because we were going up this climb and I was on the front really, really pushing the pace, like really, really hard. And there was this beautiful rainbow out the side. It was like the nicest rainbow I had ever seen in my entire life. And I turned to one of the girls around me and I said, "Oh, look at that rainbow." And they didn't look at it. And I was like, "No, look, it's a beautiful rainbow." And they just kept their eyes straight ahead. And I was like, it's the most beautiful rainbow ever. And all the girls just like refused to look. And I think they were worried that I was trying to distract them, like, because I
Mm.
wanted to attack or something. And I was like, no, like, I'm not trying to attack. Like, really, it's a beautiful rainbow. Just like look at it. And it was, I think, the only time in a race where I've really enjoyed the scenery. And the funny part of that story is afterwards, one of the riders went up to my teammate and she goes, Kristen Faulkner in that effing rainbow. Like, I was suffering so hard, and here she is talking about rainbows in the middle of the race, pushing the pace in the front, and like, what in the world does she think? That girl is crazy. and they're like, like, what is she thinking about rainbows when we're all suffering, like digging deep, trying to, make it to the top of the mountain? And so I think,
Yeah.
in different parts of the race, people can also just be in different phases. Like for me, I was suffering, but not crazy. Whereas other people who maybe weren't climbers were suffering a lot more, and they were, refusing to, like, A, they were too gassed to look at a rainbow, but B, they may have been scared that I was trying to distract them and attack. And so I think there's different variables at play as well.
Yeah, I learned that I did a lot of marathons and triathlons and stuff, and I'm always the type of racer, and I use that term loosely, um, that I'm chatty. Oh, look at that. Oh, hey, good job. Like I'm cheering people. I mean, I'm, racing, but I'm not trying to, I know I'm not going to win anything, but I'm always like, hey, look at that. And I have to remember that they're suffering. I want to move on a little bit. And we talked about sponsors a little bit. Sponsors are super important. What you're wearing on your kit is kind of like a NASCAR uniform. Can you talk about how important sponsors are and why it's important to the business of cycling?
Yeah, it's interesting. So cycling is not necessarily it's not a spectator sport in that people don't buy tickets to your event. So if you go to a baseball game, you're purchasing a ticket to watch the game. And if you go to a baseball or soccer or football game, you're paying tickets to watch. And cycling doesn't have that. People aren't paying tickets because you're on open roads that are 100 miles long. And so it's not like a stadium spectator sport in that way. And occasionally you'll have VIP tents at the finish line where people can pay to enter. But the majority of revenue for the cycling industry comes from viewership on TV. And it comes from viewership of logos on our jerseys and from the social media that we produce and all of the content. And it's usually brand sponsors for the most part. It's usually cycling brands. You have Cannondale, you have Wahoo, you have, Whoop, things that are really resonate with athletes. But then you also have some other sponsors like Oatly, for example, who are just trying to reach a broader audience, healthier lifestyle. Same with EF. Their goal is to reach a broader audience through travel and adventure, and those are really the themes that they're trying to promote to the broader public. And so these sponsors, they're paying to have their logo on our jersey, knowing that when people watch races, when people view our social media, they're going to see those brands. They're going to see that we believe in those brands, we align with those values, and then it's going to get more eyeballs on the brand. And so it's really brand awareness, which is how our entire industry is supported. And because of that, it's really important to have a team and a media team, a team manager, and writers who understand the economics of the sport. People are watching us race and then hopefully going and buying, products from companies that sponsor us. And so a lot of team managers, riders, people in the industry, like their only goal is to win races. And they don't think about anything else. They don't think about the business of the sport. And one of the things I really admire about EF Oatly Cannondale and the team that I'm on is that I feel like that the management and the team really understands the business side of sport. And they recognize that, our goal is to get on the podium because that gets visibility. But we also need to produce content and produce media and making sure that we're going to events and that we're speaking on behalf of our sponsors, because that's how we make revenue. That's how we pay our riders. That's how we pay for races and support and resources. And so I think, for me, coming from the business world, like I really appreciate that and understand that. And I think it's important for the broader public and also people in the sport to understand, how we're getting paid, because the money's not growing on trees. The money's not coming from people paying to watch us necessarily. And so it's how do we bring that money into the sport? And I think one of the interesting challenges of the sport, though, is that a lot of the media coverage of cycling, like none of those dollars make it to the athletes. And so if someone turns on the TV to watch the Tour de France, they are paying a subscription to, Peacock or Disney Plus or, GCN historically, or Flow Bikes.
Yeah.
But
RIP GCM. Sorry.
yeah, right. But the money from that media coverage is not actually going to the athletes at all. It's going strictly to those streaming companies and in some ways to the race organizers who are paying. And that's a little bit different from other industries where actually the athletes do get a portion of the TV and streaming coverage. And so I think, one of the big things that I would like to see in the future is if an athlete is, shown in a race racing the Tour de France on TV, they can also get a small piece of the media coverage money that's coming in, because right now the money from viewers, like none of that, like nothing that the viewers are paying for goes directly to the teams or athlete. It all goes to the race organizers and the streaming companies, and the only money that the athletes and teams see is through the sponsorship dollars that they go out and get themselves. And so it's a bit different than other sports in that way as well.
Which would explain a lot. A lot of times, I've heard commentators watching a race where a few riders will do a breakaway, meaning they break from the group and they go ahead however many kilometers, and it might be two or three of them. But a lot of times, the commentators will say, "Look, they're showing their brand," and they have to comment so and so for EF Education, so and so for Little Trek. I forget their title now. You bring up a good point that if teams don't highlight the sponsors as well, they fold. So many teams have come and gone because they ran out of money, or the sponsors are like, yeah, this isn't worth it. You know, um, with that too,
Definitely.
let's
And it's
go
interesting.
ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh,
Go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, occasionally it can influence race dynamics, not that much, but occasionally you'll see a team that wants a rider out in the break because they want the media coverage. And so if they know that it's a race so they can't win, they're like, well, at least we can get in the break. At least we can get the commentators to say our brand name, and at least it'll do something for our sponsors. I would say that's more common on really small teams, who maybe don't have a chance to win. I think on the big teams, they're pretty much, solely focused on the results when it comes to the race. But it is something that does happen, I think, on smaller teams or teams that don't get a lot of coverage otherwise.
Yeah. And then, with that too, we should talk about equal pay and gender equality. It's historically accurate that in many sports, cycling included, that men are paid differently than women. And I know over the past few years that's starting to change. I was reading or listening to one of your interviews where I think your first year you were making $7,000 a year, and you're also
Yeah.
working as a venture capitalist and bike racing. Can you talk about equal pay and the equality and why it's so important, and maybe what EF is doing to help support that?
Yeah, definitely. So it's only in the last few years that there's been a minimum wage implemented for the women, and there has been a minimum wage for men for quite a long time. But for years, and even when I started, the women were not earning a livable wage to be professional athletes. Many of them had to have side jobs. And so the reason why I stayed in venture capital was because I needed to make money if I wanted to be a professional cyclist, because there was, it was either that or work at Starbucks, and being VC was more lucrative. And so it was, it actually really prevented the sport from progressing, because a lot of riders couldn't invest the time into training that they needed to because they had side jobs. They couldn't invest the time into training. They couldn't take time off work to go to races. Part of the reason we didn't have long stage races is because many women couldn't even take time off work to go race an 8-day stage race. And so you have people talking about, oh, well, why don't the women have a 21-day Tour de France? It's like, well, first of all, I mean, as a few years ago, like women were working full time. Like they couldn't take 21 days off to go race. And so I think, we have to have equal pay before we can even have these long races, before we can move the sport forward. And many women in the pro peloton, they still have side jobs. For me, even after I had been racing for a few years, I worked in my off season. Even after I had left venture capital, I went to go work for a portfolio company in the off season just to help earn money, because there wasn't much money in the sport at all. And we've seen it change a little bit, but it's mostly changing at the top. You see the top riders making more money because they're getting more viewership from big events like the Tour de France and bigger sponsors. But really, we need to see, a rising tide lift all boats, and we need to see even the lowest paid riders have an increase in their salaries, because when the domestiques can't earn a significant living, that also changes the race dynamic, because they're not able to invest in the training and that they need to in the racing, and then you don't have the same development pipeline, and you kind of can't make races as unpredictable as you want to. If you have the same leaders every single race, then it's less fun. But if you have a really deep team where everyone is getting paid and everyone is strong, then suddenly you have lots of teammates who could win races, and it makes racing way more exciting, way less predictable. And you also have a much richer team when things like injuries or whatnot happen. And so I think, being able to raise the salaries of people across the board is really important. At the top and across the board, we also see, the top men are making, I think Tade makes $7 million a year just from his team. And that's not including bonuses. That's not including side sponsorships. He's probably closer to 10 million a year, if not more. And the top woman maybe makes like low six figures, maybe now like mid six figures with bonuses if she's, winning the Tour de France and other major events. But that's over a 10x difference, and that's just among the top. I mean, if you're looking at the vast majority of women, like a good woman makes, maybe 100K, most 200K, and a really great man is going to be making close to 1 million. And I think, the argument is that, well, there's more viewership of men's sports. And it's like, okay, well, how do we change that? Because when you go onto a streaming service, the entire front page is all the men's races. And it's like, well, how can we improve the viewership if we're only promoting and marketing the men's races, And so I think it has to come from lots of different angles, because people aren't going to watch women's races if they don't know about them and if they're not marketed well. So I think
Yeah.
that definitely is something that needs to change a lot. And we have teams and sponsors who are on board with it. I think Ole Canada has done a great job of producing media for the women. We produce content and not just media of races, but also behind the scenes, because that allows the audience to see the stories and the personalities of the riders. And as soon as you see the personalities and the stories, then you can really get behind someone as a fan. You're excited. You see the rivalries, you see the stories, you see the personalities. And that's so much of sport. When we watch sport, it's not just about their goals or their points that they've scored. It's like, who is the rider or the basketball player or the athlete that you look up to, that you aspire to be, because they're funny or they're engaging or they're entertaining, or you think they have an inspiring story. Like that's what needs to be shared as well.
Totally agree. And I think there has been improvement over the years in terms of coverage of what's going on in the women's races for exactly that reason. Showing the behind the scenes has made me love women's cycling. If I could hear Cecilia Lutwig drop the F bomb in an after race interview, I'm like, oh, she's so awesome. Um,
Mm.
and just to hit the rivalries between Demi Vollering and Lotte Kopecky and everyone else, like it makes it much more interesting, and they need more of that. And I think you mentioned too that the more the races are shown, the more money could come into it, and eventually too, the more you know money goes into it, viewership, then that needs to trickle down to you guys as pro cyclists, which is the
Mm-hmm.
next step, is what you're kind of saying too, right?
Exactly. It was so interesting when I started, there was not TV coverage of women's sport. And the argument was, well, no one watches it. And it's like, well, how do we even know if people are going to watch it if there's no coverage, And so then the Women's Tour de France came, and they did start showing and recording the women's races. And there is a lot of media coverage and viewership of women's races. I mean, people love watching women's races because they're exciting, they're less predictable. You have a lot more spontaneous moves. You have breaks that end up making it to the finish line. You have
Yeah.
so many different dynamics, and you have breaks caught within 5 seconds of the finish line. You have and it's just so much more action packed than some of the men's races, because the races are shorter, and so because you're squishing a lot more intensity and dynamic into a short amount of time, it makes the races very fast paced, and that's really fun for the viewers. And so I think this idea of, oh, no one watches women races. I mean, it's complete BS. Like, a lot of people watch races and find it really exciting. And I think we've proven that in the last few years. And so I think what we need to have happen now is, now that we've proven people want to watch women's cycling and it's fun to watch women's cycling, we need to see that translate into salaries, because the media coverage is there and the exposure to brands is there, and it hasn't fully translated into women's salaries yet.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and and I,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think we also need to market the women's races better, because right now, people who follow it, they follow it and they love it. But you still go to a front page of any of these streaming services, and they're not marketing the women's races on the front page. So I think that's, for sure one of the big impediments to viewership.
And it's hard to find too, who's carrying what. I mean, I have Max, which I watch a lot of races on, but then sometimes it's on Peacock and other times Flow Sports. It's hard to figure out, like this Simac Ladies Tour is on right now. I can't watch it unless I find a recap on YouTube. I was going to say that I think right now in women's sports in general is hitting not a peak, but just maybe the higher up the mountain because you have more interest in the WNBA, female soccer, football. It's just there. So I feel like the momentum's there. I really want to see it get pushed up and grow and grow and grow. You were mentioning in another interview too about, part of that challenge to make it grow is to having women in leadership roles. You mentioned that EF, your main person or general manager is a woman, Anna Vandenbregen. One of my heroes is like going back to racing, but she is in a senior leadership role as well. How can you get more women to move up the chain to show that it's a viable sport and a viable thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is that, well, first of all, having women in leadership is tremendously important. When I was in venture capital, there weren't that many women when I started at the first company I worked for. There were 16 male partners and 0 female partners, and from a performance standpoint, the firm was good, but I left because I was like, I need to have female role models who I can look up to, and I ended up going to work for a firm where I had a female role model and a female partner. And I think it just goes to show that people will leave, when they don't have role models because they don't really know what's possible. And within cycling, I have a female manager, I have a female director, I have a female nutritionist, I have a female doctor, and I value the male mentors in my life, but I don't only value the male mentors. Like, I need to have women in my life as well who I can look up to and aspire to be like, and who I know what's possible for me. And I see how they manage, having a baby while they're working. I see how they manage, the different dynamics of, maybe implicit biases that happen in a boardroom, and knowing how people handle those situations with grace and watching them assert themselves is something I learned how to do myself. And I learned it by watching. And it's really important for young girls to have those role models and to learn by watching. So I think it's great that we have women at EF Oatly Cannondale, and I hope to see more women in leadership positions at other teams. I think one of the things that has made a difference, is that women's teams now have the resources to pay women, and a lot of, we can hire women into those roles, and they can get paid. And I think historically, there was just this bias that, women didn't have the same experience and they didn't have, they hadn't raced at the elite levels because racing wasn't as competitive in the women's peloton. And I think we've seen that change. We've seen that women's races are incredibly exciting. There's a lot of strategy, and the women who are kind of graduating and retiring from racing do have the skills to go be incredible directors and managers. But so much of it was that I think we didn't have enough women in the pipeline. And then a lot of the women maybe didn't make enough money during their careers. And so they had to go make money after their careers, and cycling industry didn't pay that much. And so, they're just, they had to leave the sport to go support themselves financially. And they were kind of kicked out of the sport in that way. And not intentionally, but just because they couldn't really afford to stay in the sport.
And you mentioned role models too. You're now kind of a role model. Do you do you realize that, and how are you approaching that? You are a role model, but you're also okay. Well, I'll have you answer that. Like, so what do you think about being you mentioned role models. So do you think yourself as a role model, and are you acting any differently?
I don't think I'm acting any differently. I think, it's important to be myself if I'm going to be a role model. I think um, maybe the biggest thing is just realizing that my athletic career is bigger than just myself. I think coming in, I had these big goals for myself. I wanted to go to the Olympics. I wanted to, um, I wanted to, win certain races. And a lot of my goals were very self-centered in that way about what I wanted to accomplish. And I think now my goals have really shifted. It's, I want to make sure that before I retire from the sport, we have equal pay. Like, that's my next goal. That's my biggest goal. If I do, one thing in my career before I retire, I hope it's that. And yes, I want to go in races, but it's now about something much greater than my personal goals and about myself. It's about lifting the entire sport as a whole. And I think when I go to races, I make extra time to go sign autographs for young girls and sign water bottles. And I think that was something I didn't really spend as much time doing before. I thought about my fans, but I didn't think about the impact necessarily that I could have on them, especially the young girls. And so I think it has changed me a lot, this experience this summer. And it's really inspiring me to think about, what can I do and what impact can I have that extends beyond myself and has an impact on people other than just myself.
Yeah, that's that's fantastic. I mean, it's great to have that awareness, I think, in terms of how people view you now a little bit differently because of your two gold medals and your various wins. And I feel like you're also now, and you've been probably doing this for a while, but you're kind of a brand now. And in terms of a business model, like in order to sustain your growth, you kind of have to build a brand. How you're writing a
Mm.
book, you have a website. How are you thinking? How are you approaching this aspect of your life? Are you approaching it like you did for venture capitalism?
Yeah, in some ways I am actually, but I'm still in the very early innings. And I think what the challenge is for me right now is learning how to balance my performance goals with my business goals. Because at the end of the day, I'm still an athlete. I want to go to LA. I want to perform well in the 2028 Olympics. I want to perform well in the 4 years until then. And so I really still need to prioritize my training, my recovery, my strength, my nutrition, like all of those things, which were already a full-time job before the Olympics. And so I feel like in some ways I have two full-time jobs now where I'm trying to still be an elite athlete and perform at the top level. But I also have a lot of these really exciting business opportunities in front of me, one of which is writing a book. And so I think about, when do I want to publish it? And who exactly is my target audience? Is it cyclists? Is it women in sport? Is it people who care about gender equality? I'm talking about my mental health journey. Is it people who are experiencing mental health in cycling or also in business? And so there's a lot of different angles where I could take it. And it's thinking about, what is the message that I really want to share with people. And so that's something that's definitely on my mind. Another opportunity is I'm doing a lot of speaking engagements, especially at former VC conferences and business offsites. I think it's kind of funny how many of these opportunities I would not have had if I had stayed in venture capital. And so it's kind of interesting how life, takes you. And I think it's definitely another reason, to follow your passion is I think things do work out. And so that's really exciting for me. I'm doing a TEDx talk at the end of the month. And I think the speaking engagements, it really allows me to hone my story and figure out what resonates with people. And it's fun. And so that's a whole nother part that is time consuming from a travel standpoint and could be disruptive to my training if I'm not careful. I think another, I've had a few companies reach out that want to make a documentary about my story or a feature film about my story. And so it's figuring out, what is the timeline for that? How involved do I want to be? How do I make sure that they stay true to the integrity and authenticity of my story and don't, make it too Hollywood or, too, that I am still the one who can share my story and that it doesn't get, tangled up when other people try to tell it. And so all of those are things that are really exciting. I mean, even more than a lot of that too is just I'm going to a lot of sponsor negotiations on behalf of EO Lee Cannondale that I wasn't doing before. So I went and met with a few potential sponsors for the team, and having me in the room, and it kind of reminds me back in the days when I was in VC, like negotiating contracts, negotiating deals, negotiating financial opportunities. Because for me, I think being in the room, it's exciting for these sponsors because they're no longer just sponsoring our team; they're sponsoring a team with a two-time Olympic champion. And so I think I have influence to help improve those deals for the team, and hopefully that brings more money to the team, but also more money into women's sport, and can help pay my teammates more, can help bring more resources to the team, and then maybe we recruit more riders to the team, and I think it can help lift the entire sport. And hopefully, if I can bring in more sponsors to the team, that will improve the salaries for the team, which will recruit more girls to the team, which will force other teams to increase their salaries because suddenly the market's more competitive. And so my goal is to really start with our team and our sponsors to help change the industry kind of from the inside out. And that's something that's a big goal of mine over the next few years as well.
All right. Um, we're almost out of time. I don't want to keep you too much longer. I do have a couple questions just to end. You are one of the few high-profile American pro cyclists right now. On the male side, you have Matteo Jorgensen. You have Quinn Simmons, or Skin Quimmins, as his handle is on Instagram, Nelson Powless. Is this a really good time to get people to tune into American cycling to try to get it back to where it was pre Lance Armstrong, who kind of shot it all down? I feel like we're almost there in terms of like hey, look, we have writers. We have so many great writers. How can we lift the sport up to get more people to watch?
Absolutely. I think it's a really exciting time. I think there's also a lot of tailwinds culturally about people wanting to be healthier, have more outdoor lifestyles. I think people, the notion of being on a team with individual accountability, like all of these things these cultural transitions that we're seeing happen in American lifestyle and American business, I think can translate quite well to cycling. And I think, we're seeing urban cities, try to think about how to have more bike lanes. And so all of these things, I think, can really help us build momentum in the sport, both with viewership but also participation. And I really hope that the Olympics and the experience this summer, but also what's happening, with races throughout the year, we can leverage that to get more people excited about the sport and also to rebuild faith in the sport. I think, unfortunately, people's faith in the sport was deteriorated back in the 2000s era and 2010s. And I think getting people to realize that, the sport is clean now, it's exciting, it's fun, it's an entirely new generation with a new set of values, and really sharing that message, I think will get people on board and get people to realize that we are in a new era for US cycling, and it's an exciting time that, I hope people can be a part of, because it's a whole new era, and we're shaping it with the values um and the people that we want to have in it, and that's a really exciting thing to be building right now.
Yeah, my pitch to get people to watch more cycling is that if you're watching a football game or a basketball game, you're just watching one place. When you watch cycling, I get to see the Louvre. I get to see the Eiffel Tower. I get to see, rainbow in Norway. You're getting to see all this. I'm never going to go to Hungary, but the tour of Hungary is like beautiful. Tour of Poland. I could go on and on how beautiful cycling is when you're a fan. Kristen Faulkner, I really want to thank you for taking time on full disclosure to talk about your story and talk about what you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope we can continue these conversations offline, and yeah, and continue talking about, growth for women's sport, growth for cycling, all of these things, and I hope that this is just the start of a conversation.
Great.